Thank you. Thank you, everyone. First of all, let me say that my objection to the proposition that the internet is a human right has less to do with the nature of the internet than to the idea of a human right. Because a human right is a very specific kind of thing. And so you have to think about what exactly you're talking about here. So for example, how many of you in the audience here have heard of Abraham Maslow's pyramid of needs or hierarchy of needs? A few of you have. Actually, quite a lot of you seem to have, right? And we're talking about, and this is to a large extent kind of the background thinking behind our notion of human rights. That first you take care of material needs, then you take care of social needs in terms of your ability to organize yourselves and deal with people in your own community, and then there are these kind of higher order needs, which enable you to deal with the rest of the world, to deal with the cosmos, all this kind of stuff. And those of you who remember Maslow or have read Maslow know that, in a sense, he sees us as going up this pyramid, up this ladder toward the top. The point I want to make to you is that when he constructed this kind of idea, and I think this idea is still very much part of our notion of human rights, there was an assumption in which things happened in a particular order, right? In other words, you take care of the material needs, you take care of the social needs, and then you take care of these kind of virtual social needs, which is what the internet is actually addressing. And the problem with making the internet a human right in the world in which we're living in now is the fact that we still have a large number of people for whom the fundamental needs have yet to be met. Okay? Now, I'm afraid to say, however, that the history of human rights, so when we talk about human rights now, we're talking about the 1948 Universal Declaration, United Nations, all that kind of stuff, which actually had this kind of Maslow vision in mind, where you're trying to provide for the material and spiritual needs of people in that order. However, if you look at the history of human rights, the people who have typically made the biggest noise about having human rights are people who already had most of the stuff Maslow's talking about taken care of. In other words, the material needs were already being taken care of. And so let me give you an example from the United States, which is where I'm from originally. The First Amendment right is freedom of expression. Second is the right to bear arms. Okay? Now, you think about that for a moment. That's the first two amendments of the Bill of Rights. It's not the right to food, security, material stuff, etc. It is the right to express yourself. Well, who would put that as the fundamental human right unless you already are pretty wealthy and you're somehow being repressed or stopped by political regimes? Okay? So in other words, the bar is already set high with the idea of human rights. And in the sense, that has driven the human rights discourse for most of the history of the thing. So even the idea of the right to bear arms. Why do you want to bear arms in the first place unless you've got something to protect? Right? So you need to have property. You need to have stuff already before that even becomes relevant. But we actually live in a world where a large number of people have yet to actually have secure water, have secure food, have a secure place to live. We're still in a world like that, people, and the putting a primacy on the internet as a human right in a way exacerbates this problem that has already existed within the history of human rights discourse.
Well, Steve, it's pretty convincing, I have to say, but there's something that does nudge me, in that in 2017, these people that don't get these material needs, they don't have access to their basic fundamental needs as human beings in society. Without the internet, doesn't it even keep them further apart? Doesn't it even keep them more distant?
I think this is a very mixed story, and this is why you have to look at exactly where the internet and especially smartphone penetration has been throughout the world. And in a sense, that the penetration of those things has actually been a lot better than the kinds of inequalities that you're talking about. So there's a sense in which that very often what you find is that you have people from relatively impoverished areas, whether we're talking about economically or maybe even in terms of politically repressive regimes, where there's actually a fair amount of access to the internet, but they're not actually doing anything to redress those kinds of issues. Okay? So the internet, in a way, is a facility, right? It obviously allows you to do more, but the question is, what are you doing it with? And if all the internet is doing is to basically exaggerate tendencies you've already have, rather than to get you to the next level, then the internet can be potentially a retardant.
I have to say, I can't really refute that anymore. I have to say I agree with you on that one, Steve. I don't see where we can call it a basic human right. So I think this myth has been burned. Would you agree with me? This myth goes in the barrel and burns. Well done. All right, okay. He's got off to a decent start here, but access should be provided to one and all. Mr. Berners-Lee has claimed this time and time again. The man who gave us the World Wide Web says this is something that needs to be for everyone.
Okay, that sounds great, right? But then, we need to think about what exactly would they be doing with it if they have access to it. And the history that we've seen so far, and I've mentioned this earlier, is that in fact, we have not seen great revolutions and great kind of transformations in inequality and so forth that we already had back in the 1960s and up to the 90s, right, before the internet came on stream. They're still there. If not, they're even worse, okay? You would have expected, given that we actually do live in a world where there is quite a lot of internet access, that this would have been seriously redressed by now. But it's not, okay? Which leads me to think that the internet is not some kind of panacea for actually solving the world's problems, and that somehow making it more available to everyone will somehow make things better. Because already it is available to a lot of people, and even in people in disadvantaged places, and it's not actually improving the situation.
I mean, you're saying that even if we look at the example of China, where we do know that there is a spotty amount of internet available to large groups of people, you're saying even there, without having any sort of model, any sort of research to tell us, is this keeping these people further away from understanding what's going on in modern society?
Well, look, there is obviously the question of censorship of the internet once it's there, but, to a large extent, my view would be, if I were advising China, that it's overkill to censor the internet in China, because in fact, if you just let the ordinary Chinese people follow the general trajectories of the way the internet performs in the rest of the world with regard to capitalist consumption or whatever you want to call it, you're not going to get a revolution. You're not going to get a revolution in China. You're not going to get everything. No, just let it happen, right? In other words, if you let people carry on in their default patterns, whereby they want to have the people who already have a certain amount of material existence are actually allowed to have a greater amount of that, that's bound to actually boost the economy. The question is going to be the people who are still at the ground level, whether they'll be able to do anything, right? And in fact, let me just add this point, that with regard to things like development aid and so forth, right, where very often there are efforts brought into Africa, let's say, to give people smartphones and internet access and so forth, unless you have those development aid people there kind of instructing and organizing and enabling all of these kinds of collective effects of the internet to actually improve the people's environments, it doesn't happen spontaneously. It doesn't happen spontaneously. So in other words, censorship as an issue is, I think, overrated. That actually, given the world we live in, you remove censorship, there's still no guarantee there'd be any major social transformation in the world. You just have more capitalists.
All right. Well, as a father of three, I understand this forbidden fruit concept. When you do keep things away, it tends to make people a bit more focused on
them. And they sort of hallucinate what they think they would be accomplishing.
And they're projecting things that don't even necessarily exist there.
Yeah.
So access should not necessarily be provided to all. I believe this myth has been burned. You beat me to the toss, guys. All right, but surely, Steve, higher penetration leads to more enlightened people. You can't refute that. I mean, if you have access to see what is going on in the multitudes of the world, all these incredible layers that the internet provides for people, it's got to lead to people being in the know.
I know, that's what they say. But let me start with a subtle point before getting into what I really want to say. The subtle point is, look, you can have enlightened people in the sense of being informed about what's happening all over the world. And so you can be up to date with the latest atrocity happening off your shores. No doubt about it. You can even be up to date on the atrocities happening in your shores, right? But that doesn't necessarily do anything to improve the situation, right? It just becomes part of the kind of media consumption environment. It becomes like a new reality TV show, okay? And that's what enlightenment boils down to when we're talking about things in these terms, okay? So there's a sense in which having more enlightened people, if you measure that in terms of being more informed, doesn't do anything by itself to improve the human condition, okay? It just means you've got more channels to watch. That's all it means, okay? So there's obviously something more than the internet that is necessary if we're talking about something kind of progressive or going beyond where we are now, which is kind of the thrust of the whole idea of having the internet being made a human right. In terms of higher penetration, the thing that comes to mind, which always leads me to dismiss this argument, is United Arab Emirates. They're the most penetrated people in the world, okay, with regard to the internet. And are they changing the world? Right? I mean, you look at the habits of the people who are at the top end of what we're talking about here. And it does not follow necessarily that these people are in the forefront of any kind of major social transformation. If anything, they are very stable, right? And stability is something different. Because when we start making arguments about trying to make things into human rights, what we're really arguing about is trying to make human beings better than they are, not to keep them as they already are. And my fear is that the internet actually encourages this kind of stabilization at whatever level the ruling regime wants.
So you're saying mediocrity is often the result of being subjected or exposed to a lot of the internet?
Well, I mean, I think it's a stabilization pattern. Right, and so when we talk about things like, the echo chambers, right, and filter bubbles and all this kind of stuff that people talk about with regard to the internet, this is what we mean.
I agree with that. I think you've got a really, really resounding point there. But there is part of me that says that when you get 90% of predictability, and people will go with the flow, they will tend to migrate to the things that other people around them migrate towards. And I do think we get a stagnation. We do find this middle level of essentially stagnation or static behavior. However, the superconductive events usually come from that 10% of events and people, and the type of activator people that actually are subjected to this. And without this, will they make the revolutionary change? Will they be inspired to change the thing without this access?
Maybe that is true. Maybe, I mean, historically that is true. Let's put it that way. So let me grade you the initial point, that historically that is true. Whether the internet does that as a catalyst is an open question. And look, some of you may know, the first year that this brain bar took place, Yevgeny Morozov was a speaker here. And he wrote the book, The Net Delusion, and to save everything, click here, right? You may know about this guy. And he was pointing to the Arab Spring, right? Because the Arab Spring sounds a bit like what you're talking about.
Mixed reviews, Steve.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, the Arab Spring, was something that at the time it took place in 2010, for all you young people who don't remember that far back, right? This was seen as some great kind of upheaval. And it was, in fact, prompted largely in the case of Egypt by the fact that Mubarak was closing down the internet so people couldn't get stuff. And so all of a sudden you started to get this kind of uprising that took place that overturned the government and then was copied by other places throughout the Arab world, basically, in the 2010, 2011 period. Look where we are now. Look where we are now.
All right. Fair enough, Steve. I will say higher penetration does not necessarily give us a direct correlation to more enlightenment. So this myth, I'm going to start timing it differently. But Steve, everyone uses the internet equally. Isn't that the way it ends up? Because we've got to get our news, we've got to write our mails, we have our work demands, our social life. Everybody, it kind of all evens out. Don't we all kind of spread ourselves just about evenly on the internet?
No, see, here's the thing, right? And this goes back to the point of the kind of people who in the past have mobilized for particular forms of human rights. They are usually people who already have something to gain by it, okay? So you think about the free expression and the right to bear arms in the American context. These were property owners who, in fact, had a lot of ideas but being censored for religious reasons and so forth. So if they're given a right to express themselves, then they will go to town. Will anyone else go to town? Not so clear, right? Because those people don't have property, they don't have the capacities, all the rest of it. And so making something a human right basically potentially provides a kind of amplifier for those who are already able and willing to move ahead, and then the others who really weren't part of the scene in the first place would be left behind, okay? So, for example, this proposition, everyone will use the internet equally. What do you think? My view is, one thing that just comes off the top of my head when I see this phrase is, well, this will be one way of increasing intergenerational divide, right? Yeah. That'll be, right, in terms of it's the younger people, generally speaking, who are already more on top of this, and they will be the ones who will be more mobilizing for it. And it may be that the older generations who've never got on board with this will in fact say, what's the point of this? Why do you need to turn this into a human right? This is kind of a waste of time. Now, whatever view you have on this matter, whatever the result will be that you will have an increased difference taking place, because one group of people will be able to take advantage of this much more effectively because they're already primed to do it, whereas the rest of the population will just be left behind. And so, if anything, this is a very illusory notion, and I think it comes from the fact, in terms of the way we talk about these matters in politics and economics generally, that there's a tendency to conflate the idea of equality with the idea of openness. And making something open, which is in fact what we're talking about when we talk about a right? It means that you are allowed to do it, right? Being allowed to do something doesn't necessarily mean you will do it or you're likely to do it. But the point is the fact that you now make it available for certain people to do it, right? I mean, the people who will do it will be the ones who are already prone to do it, and the others will not. Right? Not everyone, exercises their equal right to free expression in the same way. Some people keep their mouths shut.
And thank God for bearing arms, most people.
Well, exactly. No, exactly. And that's why that's such a touchy issue in the United States, because too many people take up the initiative and say, I'm allowed to bear arms? Okay, I'm going to bear arms. Right? And the point is, this is also going to be true of the internet thing, that if you have equal access, then the people who are already out there ahead of the game, because they're already using the internet a lot, will be able to increase their advantage.
I think it's busted here, but at least let us have this before we toss this in. When they're on the internet, at least they're doing good things.
Explain hacking.
Yeah.
No, I mean, but this is the point, right? I would think that in the future, that if we actually do have a human right to internet, it's going to be harder to prosecute hacking, right? Because how do you define it and so forth? Because you're going to say, well, look, don't I have a free right? Isn't the internet a kind of commons that everyone has access to and all the rest of it? And so the burden of proof then gets put on someone who wants to be overprotective with regard to whatever data and stuff they have. Okay, and so I do think that's something you're opening yourself up to. I mean, let me draw a distinction. I think a distinction here might be useful. In the history of when we think about human rights, again, in this kind of tradition where it came from, we talk about the right to have property, private property, okay? And then there are, once you grant the right to have private property, then there are rules under which private property is governed, okay? And I think, to be honest with you, this would be a better way for the internet to go, right? In the sense that you don't just want to open up something unless you have got conditions under which people are responsible for what they do. And this has always been a problem with the free expression issue, right? That everyone has free expression, and all of a sudden, what happens if my words impact on you adversely?
Right. Screaming in the theater fire,
exactly.
Or whatever it is.
It seems to me and so that's already a precedent that shows that just making the internet a human right is in a way going to exacerbate the kinds of problems that we've already faced with the idea of free expression. Only it's going to make it technologically, more difficult. And so we really would need to think about this in a very serious way, because it by no means follows that everyone will be able to use it for the good. But one thing I do think will follow if we have is that there'll be a lot of lawsuits and there'll be a lot of jobs for lawyers out there if we actually made the internet a human right.
So with this myth has been burned. Lawyers rejoice because you have a future, and we will. Steve Fuller.
Yes.
Thank you, sir, so much.
Thank you.
Burned these myths.